A rich CEO decided to humiliate a black cleaning lady by making her sing in front of an audience. But he had no idea that her voice would shock everyone in the audience. Subscribe, share this video with your friends, and tell us where you're watching from. The hum of the early morning traffic echoed faintly in the background as Louise carefully locked the door of her small apartment. She pulled her worn coat tighter around her shoulders, bracing against the biting chill of dawn. It was still dark, and the city streets felt almost deserted, save for the occasional bus rumbling past and the flickering glow of streetlights. This was the quietest part of her day, a brief moment of solitude before she stepped into the world of Langston Enterprises, a towering edifice of steel and glass where she worked as a cleaner. Louise's mornings were always the same. A quick breakfast of reheated leftovers, a whispered prayer for strength, and a hurried walk to the subway station. Her days blurred into one another, a ceaseless cycle of labor that left her body aching and her dreams buried under the weight of reality. But in these early hours, as she navigated the sleepy city, fragments of her old aspirations would surface, unbidden. She had once been a girl full of hope, with a voice that could command a room. Growing up in a small, tight-knit community, Louise's singing had been her identity. Church choirs, local talent shows, and impromptu performances at family gatherings, all had been her stage. Her mother used to sit in their modest living room watching her daughter belt out gospel hymns with a voice so rich and soulful it could bring tears to anyone listening. "Your voice is a gift from God," her mother often said, her pride evident in her eyes. Louise had believed her. For a time she was certain that her voice would be her ticket to a better life. She dreamed of stages, of lights, of a world where she could share her gift and feel valued for it. But dreams, she learned, didn't always withstand the weight of the world. The first blow came during her high school years when a scholarship audition for a prestigious music academy turned sour. Despite a flawless performance, the panel's polite smiles didn't mask their judgment. One of the judges, an older man with a condescending tone, had remarked, "You have talent, but this institution has a particular image to maintain." Louise had been too young to fully grasp the coded language of his words, but her mother had understood. "You're too good for them," her mother had reassured her later, though the bitterness in her voice betrayed the hurt they both felt. After that, rejection became a familiar companion. Community performances dwindled as Louise threw herself into part-time jobs to help support her family. Her father's unexpected passing left her mother struggling to keep their household afloat, and Louise had no choice but to step in. College was a dream deferred, replaced by long shifts at diners and cleaning jobs that paid just enough to scrape by. Now, years later, the remnants of that dream lingered only in stolen moments. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet and her responsibilities momentarily set aside, she would hum softly to herself, her voice filling the space with the echoes of what could have been. Her arrival at Langston Enterprises marked the start of another day of anonymity. The building loomed ahead, its polished facade glinting under the first light of dawn. Inside, the sterile corridors and pristine offices were a world away from the warmth of her childhood home. Louise moved through these spaces like a shadow, unnoticed and unacknowledged by the executives and employees who strode past her without so much as a glance. Yet, Louise had learned to take solace in her invisibility. It allowed her to observe without interference, to dream in silence as she worked. The gentle hum of her cleaning cart and the rhythmic swish of her mop often accompanied her as she replayed memories of her mother's encouragement or imagined a life where she had pursued her passion. But even in these fleeting moments of reflection, reality was never far behind. Her brother, James, was in his second year of college, a feat that had only been possible because Louise sent him a significant portion of her earnings. Their aunt, who had raised them after their mother's death, was battling a chronic illness that required costly treatments. The weight of these responsibilities was a constant presence, grounding her whenever her mind dared to wander too far. That morning, as she polished the floors of the executive wing, Louise caught her reflection in the gleaming surface. Her face, framed by the simple scarf she wore to keep her hair neat, looked tired but determined. She had grown used to the strain etched into her features, the faint lines that had appeared too early. Yet there was still a spark in her eyes, a quiet resilience that refused to be extinguished. "Good morning," a passing employee muttered absently, not waiting for a response. Louise nodded politely, though she doubted the woman had even noticed. Interactions like these were common, fleeting, and impersonal. She had become part of the scenery, a necessary but unnoticed cog in the machine of Langston Enterprises. By the time her shift ended, the building was fully alive with activity. Employees rushed to meetings, their voices blending into a chorus of urgency. Louise slipped out quietly, her presence as unassuming as ever. On her way home, she stopped by the grocery store to pick up essentials, calculating her expenses with precision. Every dollar counted, and she couldn't afford to waste even a cent. As she walked back to her apartment, bags in hand, the melody of an old hymn surfaced in her mind. It was one her mother used to sing during tough times, a reminder of faith and perseverance. Louise hummed it softly, her voice carrying over the quiet street. For a moment, it felt like the weight of the world had lifted, leaving only the music. Louise paused outside her building, looking up at the stars just beginning to appear in the evening sky. Her mother had once told her that dreams were like stars, distant but always visible if you knew where to look. Tonight, those stars felt impossibly far away, but Louise reminded herself that they were still there. She had buried her dreams, but she hadn't forgotten them. As she stepped inside, she resolved to face another day with the same quiet strength that had carried her this far. What she didn't know was that the life she had resigned herself to was about to be turned upside down in ways she could never have imagined. Langston Enterprises was not just a building, it was a monument to excess. Towering above the bustling city streets, the structure symbolized power, wealth, and unshakable authority. Inside, every surface gleamed with a polished perfection. Marble floors, chrome railings, and glass walls that reflected the opulence of its occupants. For Louise, it was a daily reminder of the stark divide between the worlds of those who worked in the offices and those who cleaned them. At the top of this corporate empire sat Simon Willard, the enigmatic CEO who embodied everything the company stood for. He was in his early 40s, sharp-featured, and always impeccably dressed in tailored suits that spoke of wealth few could imagine. Simon's name carried weight in the financial world, and his reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded him. But for those who worked under him, he was more than a businessman. He was a force to be reckoned with, a man whose sharp wit often came with a sharper edge of cruelty. Simon thrived on control. His days were a carefully choreographed dance of meetings, power plays, and strategic decisions designed to keep him at the top. He commanded not only respect but also fear, a fact he relished. Employees often joked in hushed tones that Simon didn't just run Langston Enterprises, he ruled it. And, like any ruler, he enjoyed reminding others of their place. For Louise, Simon was the personification of the corporate elite. She had rarely crossed paths with him directly, but his presence was felt throughout the building. Stories of his cutting remarks and public humiliations circulated among the staff, serving as cautionary tales for those who might dare to step out of line. Louise knew better than to draw attention to herself. She kept her head down, did her work diligently, and avoided interactions with anyone who might report back to Simon. One Monday morning, however, fate placed Louise squarely in Simon's line of sight. She was in the executive wing, meticulously cleaning the hallway outside his office. It was early enough that the floor was mostly empty, save for a few assistants bustling in and out with documents. Louise moved with practiced efficiency, her mop gliding across the floor in smooth, deliberate strokes. The sudden sound of footsteps drew her attention. Turning her head slightly, she saw Simon striding toward her, his expression unreadable but his gaze sharp. His appearance was as commanding as ever: navy suit, polished shoes, and a watch that likely cost more than her yearly salary. Louise quickly averted her eyes, focusing on her task, hoping he would pass without incident. "Miss." His voice cut through the air, crisp and commanding. Louise froze for a moment before straightening and turning to face him. His eyes flicked briefly to her name tag. "Louise, is it?" "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone respectful but cautious. Her grip on the mop tightened slightly, her instincts warning her that this interaction would not end well. Simon gestured toward a section of the floor she had just cleaned. "You missed a spot," he said, his tone neutral but laced with the faintest hint of disdain. Louise glanced at the floor. The marble surface gleamed under the overhead lights, spotless. She hesitated, wondering if she had indeed overlooked something, but before she could respond, Simon continued. "It's not a difficult job," he said, his words deliberate and cutting. "Surely you can manage to do it properly." Heat rose to Louise's cheeks, but she kept her expression composed. "I'll take care of it, sir," she said softly, turning back to her work. She felt his gaze linger on her for a moment longer before he finally walked away. The encounter left her shaken, though she had no time to dwell on it. There were still offices to clean, bathrooms to restock, and floors to polish. As she worked, she replayed Simon's words in her mind, each syllable a reminder of her place in the hierarchy of Langston Enterprises. It wasn't the first time she had faced such condescension, and it likely wouldn't be the last. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the weight of Simon's remarks lingered. That night, as Louise returned to her modest apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling of being reduced to nothing more than her role. It wasn't just Simon's words that stung, it was the reminder that, in his eyes and the eyes of many others, she was invisible until she wasn't, and then only to be criticized. Simon, meanwhile, had already forgotten about the interaction. For him, it was a fleeting moment, barely worth noting. He thrived on these small displays of power, finding satisfaction in asserting his superiority over those he deemed beneath him. But beneath his confident exterior was a man driven by insecurity, his need for control masking the cracks in his carefully constructed image. Langston Enterprises operated like a well-oiled machine, but its culture was one of quiet fear. Employees tread carefully, avoiding missteps that might draw Simon's ire. For Louise, this environment was both suffocating and familiar. She had long since learned to navigate such spaces, blending into the background and keeping her dreams hidden where no one could use them against her. What Louise didn't realize was that her invisibility would not last forever. The events set in motion that day would soon collide with the life she had worked so hard to keep in the shadows, forcing her into a spotlight she had long since stopped chasing. The office building was nearly empty when Louise began her late-night shift in the executive conference hall. Most of the staff had already gone home, leaving the cavernous room eerily silent. The only sounds were the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic swish of her mop against the polished marble floor. Louise preferred working in the quiet hours. There was a calmness in the solitude that allowed her mind to wander, to revisit memories she kept locked away during the busy parts of her day. The massive, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering cityscape below, and for a moment, she let herself imagine what it would feel like to belong to that world rather than existing on its margins. She paused her work to stretch her sore shoulders, glancing around the empty room. The long mahogany conference table stood at the center like an altar to power, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs that seemed to silently command respect. She was insignificant in this space, a presence so inconsequential that even the furniture seemed to overshadow her. But here, with no one watching, Louise felt free. As she often did when no one was around, Louise began to hum. It started softly, almost like a whisper, but the resonance of the room invited her to let the melody grow. Her voice filled the space, climbing higher and richer with each note. It was an old gospel song, one her mother used to sing, and the familiar tune brought a bittersweet comfort. The acoustics in the room were remarkable, amplifying her voice in a way that made it feel like the walls themselves were singing with her. Louise closed her eyes, losing herself in the music. For those few moments, she wasn't a janitor. She was simply Louise, the girl who had once dreamed of standing on a stage, the girl who still carried a spark of that dream deep inside. What she didn't know was that she wasn't alone. Simon Willard had stayed late that evening, his schedule packed with meetings and calls that extended long past business hours. He was on his way to his office when he heard the sound. He stopped mid-stride, listening as the melody floated through the hallway. For a moment, he thought it might be a recording, some kind of ambient music playing in the building, but the raw, unpolished emotion in the voice told him otherwise. Following the sound, Simon stepped quietly into the conference room. He stayed in the shadows, his sharp eyes narrowing as he spotted Louise standing at the far end of the room, her back to him. She was singing as if no one was watching, her hands gripping the mop like a microphone stand. The scene was so unexpected, so utterly incongruous with his image of her, that he stood frozen, watching and listening. Louise's voice was nothing short of extraordinary. It wasn't just the technical precision of her singing, though that was impressive. It was the emotion behind it, the way her voice carried a weight of longing and resilience that struck a chord deep within him. For a brief moment, Simon felt something unfamiliar, admiration, perhaps even envy, but as quickly as it came, the feeling was replaced by a sense of superiority. He stepped back into the hallway, careful not to let his presence be known. As he walked away, his mind began to work. Louise's talent intrigued him, but not for the reasons one might expect. To Simon, it was an opportunity, a chance to turn her into a spectacle, to entertain himself and others at her expense. He didn't see her as a person with dreams or struggles. She was merely a tool, another way for him to assert his dominance. The next day, Simon made his decision. He was planning a high-profile corporate event to showcase the company's achievements to its investors and clients. The evening was meant to be a celebration of his success, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and power. And now, it had an additional layer. He would make Louise sing at the event, not as a performer, but as a novelty. The idea amused him, and he was certain it would amuse his guests as well. For Louise, the days leading up to the event passed without incident. She continued her routine, unaware of Simon's plans. She noticed nothing unusual, except for the occasional glance or whispered comment from her coworkers. She attributed it to the upcoming event. The building was always abuzz with gossip when something big was happening. It wasn't until the evening of the event that Louise's world began to shift. Langston Enterprises had transformed the conference hall into a glittering venue. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm golden light over the elegantly decorated space. Tables were adorned with fine linens, crystal glassware, and floral arrangements that probably cost more than Louise's monthly rent. Servers in crisp uniforms moved through the crowd, offering trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Louise was tasked with cleaning up any spills and keeping the space pristine throughout the evening. She moved unobtrusively through the crowd, her cleaning cart tucked in a corner. As the event progressed, she noticed Simon watching her from across the room, a sly smile playing on his lips. She tried to ignore him, focusing on her work, but the weight of his gaze made her uneasy. Toward the middle of the evening, Simon took the stage to address his guests. His voice boomed confidently as he spoke about the company's achievements and its bright future. The crowd hung on his every word, laughing at his jokes and applauding at the appropriate moments. "And now," Simon said, his tone shifting to something more playful, "I'd like to introduce you all to a hidden gem of Langston Enterprises, someone who has a rather unexpected talent." Louise froze. Her heart began to race as she realized he was looking directly at her. "Louise," he said, gesturing for her to come forward, "why don't you join us up here? I think everyone would love to hear what you can do." The room fell silent as every head turned to look at her. Louise felt the weight of their stares, a mix of curiosity and amusement. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and vanish. But there was no escape. The spotlight was on her, whether she wanted it or not. Swallowing hard, Louise stepped forward, her legs feeling like lead. She had no idea how Simon knew about her singing, but it was clear that this was not an opportunity. It was a trap. As she approached the stage, she could hear the murmurs of the guests, their voices tinged with anticipation and skepticism. When she finally reached the microphone, Simon leaned down and whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "Don't disappoint us." Louise gripped the microphone tightly, her hands trembling. She glanced out at the crowd, their expectant faces blurring together. Her mind raced, torn between fear and defiance. For a moment, she thought about refusing, about walking away and leaving them all in stunned silence. But then she remembered her mother's words, the ones she had held on to for so many years. "Your voice is your power. Never let anyone take it from you." Taking a deep breath, Louise closed her eyes. The room fell silent as she began to sing. The silence in the room was suffocating as Louise gripped the microphone. Her heart pounded in her chest and her palms were slick with sweat. For a moment, she considered turning around and leaving the stage, but the weight of every gaze in the room held her in place. This wasn't a performance, it was a spectacle, orchestrated to belittle her. She could feel it in the smirks on some of the guests' faces and in Simon's self-satisfied posture as he stood at the side of the stage, his arms crossed, waiting to enjoy the show. Louise took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. She had been in the spotlight before, years ago, when singing was her dream rather than an impossible fantasy. But back then, the audience had been supportive, eager to hear her. Now, the room was filled with strangers who had no idea who she was or what this moment meant to her. To them, she was just a janitor, a curiosity plucked from obscurity for their amusement. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Your voice is your power. Never let anyone silence you. The memory steadied her trembling hands. She wasn't here to entertain Simon or his elite guests. If she was going to sing, it would be for herself. She closed her eyes and let the melody come to her. It was an old gospel hymn, one she had sung countless times as a child. The first note escaped her lips, soft and tentative, barely audible over the hum of the room. But as she found the rhythm, her voice grew stronger, richer, filling the space with a depth and emotion that silenced the whispers and murmurs around her. The room changed. The laughter faded, replaced by an almost palpable stillness. The guests, who had been prepared to smirk and scoff, found themselves unable to look away. Louise's voice wasn't just beautiful, it was transcendent. Each note carried years of pain, hope, and resilience, weaving a story that needed no words to be understood. Simon's confident smirk faltered as he watched the room's reaction. This was not the outcome he had anticipated. He had expected awkwardness, maybe even ridicule, something that would solidify his dominance over the evening. Instead, he found himself mesmerized, unable to deny the power of her voice. For the first time in years, Simon felt something he rarely experienced: vulnerability. He had no control over what was happening. Louise opened her eyes as the final note faded into silence. The room remained still for a moment, as if everyone was holding their breath. Then a single clap broke the silence, followed by another and another. Soon the entire room erupted into applause, loud, thunderous, and sincere. Some guests stood, their faces awash with emotion, while others wiped away tears. Louise stepped back from the microphone, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. The applause washed over her like a wave, but she didn't smile. This wasn't their victory, it was hers. She had taken a moment designed to humiliate her and turned it into a triumph. Simon remained rooted to the spot, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. He tried to regain his composure, clapping along with the crowd, but it was clear to anyone watching that he had lost control of the narrative. The evening, which had been meant to showcase his power and charisma, now belonged entirely to Louise. As she stepped off the stage, several guests approached her, their expressions warm and genuine. One woman, dressed in an elegant evening gown, clasped Louise's hands and said, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Thank you for sharing that with us." Another man, older and dressed simply despite the grandeur of the event, added, "You have a gift. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Louise nodded politely, accepting their compliments, but she didn't linger. She wanted nothing more than to retreat to the quiet of the janitor's closet, away from the stares and the overwhelming emotions coursing through her. As she turned to leave, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she found herself face to face with Simon. "That was unexpected," he said, his tone carefully measured. There was no trace of the condescension he had shown earlier, but his words felt hollow. He seemed to be searching for something to say, some way to reclaim the upper hand, but Louise offered him no such opportunity. "Thank you, sir," she replied simply, her voice steady but devoid of warmth. With that, she walked away, leaving Simon standing alone amid the applause and admiration meant for her. Back in the janitor's closet, Louise leaned against the door, her body trembling from the adrenaline. She had done it. She had faced her fear and stood her ground. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Unbeknownst to her, among the crowd that night was a man who had been watching her performance with keen interest. Charles Bennett, a well-known music producer, had been invited to the event as a guest of one of the investors. He had come expecting the usual pomp and circumstance, but Louise's voice had captivated him in a way nothing else had in years. As the evening wound down, Charles made a quiet decision. He would find a way to speak with Louise before the night was over. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change forever. The night had shifted in ways no one could have predicted. Louise's performance lingered in the air, an intangible presence that had transformed the room. The guests, once abuzz with idle chatter and superficial exchanges, were now subdued, their expressions contemplative. Her voice had cut through the layers of pretense, exposing something raw and human in every one who heard it. Louise stood off to the side of the event, her cleaning cart tucked neatly in the corner. Her hands were still trembling, though she kept them hidden behind her back. The applause had died down, but the weight of the moment hadn't left her. She felt the heat of countless eyes on her, but unlike before, it no longer felt oppressive. There was no mockery, no smirks, only awe. Simon Willard stood near the center of the room, a drink in his hand and a tight smile on his face. He looked as though he was trying to enjoy the lingering admiration of the crowd, but his usual air of confidence was notably absent. For the first time, he wasn't the focal point of the evening. Every conversation he overheard revolved around Louise's performance. "She's incredible," someone said nearby. "Where has she been hiding all this time?" "I've never heard anything like it," another guest remarked, their voice tinged with emotion. That wasn't just talent. That was soul. Simon's grip on his glass tightened. The evening had spiraled out of his control, and no matter how hard he tried to reclaim the spotlight, the guest's attention remained firmly fixed on Louise. It was a bitter pill to swallow for a man who thrived on dominance, who prided himself on orchestrating every detail of his world. Louise, meanwhile, stayed at the edge of the room, her back to the wall as she observed the scene. A part of her wanted to slip away unnoticed, to retreat into the familiar safety of anonymity. But another part of her, the part that still carried the embers of her forgotten dreams, refused to shrink back. Tonight, she had reclaimed something she thought she had lost forever. This moment, however fleeting, belonged to her. As the night wore on, guests began approaching Louise with words of praise and admiration. A woman in a sleek black dress clasped her hands and said, "You have a gift, my dear. Truly, I hope you're planning to pursue it." An older man, his silver hair neatly combed, added, "If I could bottle the feeling your voice gave me, I'd never have a bad day again." "Thank you for sharing that with us." Louise smiled politely, nodding her thanks, but she struggled to find the right words. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, and the sudden shift from invisibility to adoration left her feeling exposed. Still, she felt a flicker of pride, a quiet reassurance that her voice hadn't been silenced. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to be heard. Toward the end of the evening, as the guests began to thin out, a man approached her with a calm, purposeful stride. He was older, perhaps in his early 60s, with a neatly trimmed beard and kind eyes that crinkled slightly when he smiled. He wasn't dressed as extravagantly as the other guests. His attire was simple, understated, yet impeccably tailored. "Miss Louise, is it?" he asked, his voice warm and genuine. Louise nodded cautiously. "Yes, sir, that's me." "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, extending a hand. "My name is Charles Bennett. I'm a music producer." Her heart skipped a beat. The words felt surreal, almost like a line from a movie. She hesitated before shaking his hand, unsure of what to say. "I just wanted to tell you how much your performance moved me," Charles continued. "It's rare to find a voice like yours, one that carries not just technical skill, but true emotion. You sang with your soul tonight, and it was remarkable." "Thank you," Louise said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The sincerity in his tone disarmed her, and she found herself relaxing slightly. "I don't want to take up too much of your time," Charles said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a business card. "But if you're interested, I'd love to talk more. I work with a collective that focuses on nurturing undiscovered talent. It's not glitzy or glamorous, but it's a start. A chance to share your gift with a wider audience." Louise stared at the card for a moment, her mind racing. Was this real? Could this be the opportunity she had stopped daring to hope for? She took the card with trembling fingers, her eyes meeting his. I don't know what to say," she admitted. Charles smiled gently. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. If you're interested, give me a call. I'd be honored to work with you." As Charles walked away, Louise clutched the card tightly, as though it might vanish if she let go. She glanced around the room, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. This night, which had started as another shift in a long string of thankless days, had become a turning point. From across the room, Simon watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. He didn't recognize Charles, but he could tell from the man's demeanor that he was someone of importance. Simon's jaw clenched. The evening had not gone as planned, and the sight of Louise being praised, admired, even offered an opportunity, felt like a personal affront. But Louise paid no attention to Simon. She had no room in her heart for his condescension anymore. As she prepared to leave for the night, the business card still clutched in her hand, she felt a quiet but powerful shift within her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar yet unmistakable. Hope. Tonight, she had found her voice again, and no one, not even Simon Willard, could take that away from her. The sun had barely risen when Louise woke the next morning. Her body was heavy with exhaustion from the night before, but her mind was alive, racing with thoughts she could hardly organize. The events of the corporate party replayed in her head like a film on loop. Every note she had sung, every word of praise she had received, and, most vividly, the moment Charles Bennett handed her his business card. They all felt surreal, like they had happened to someone else. She sat at her small kitchen table, holding the card between her fingers. The name Charles Bennett was printed in elegant script, accompanied by the name of his collective and a phone number. Her thumb brushed over the embossed letters as she stared at it, her mind tugging her in two directions. On one hand, this could be the chance she had always dreamed of, the one she had believed was forever out of reach. But on the other hand, it was a risk. Pursuing this opportunity meant stepping into an unknown world, one that could reject her just as cruelly as others had in the past. And then there were her responsibilities. Her brother, James, depended on her support for his education, and her aunt's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. Could she really justify chasing a dream when so many people were counting on her? The sound of her phone buzzing snapped her out of her thoughts. It was a message from James, a simple, "Good morning," followed by a photo of him at his dorm. He looked happy, his smile wide and carefree, and Louise felt a pang of pride. She had worked so hard to give him the chance for a better life. But seeing his joy reminded her of something else. Her mother's unwavering belief that everyone deserved to follow their dreams. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. God gave you a gift for a reason. Don't let anyone make you think it's not worth sharing. Louise inhaled deeply, steeling herself. She picked up her phone and dialed the number on the card. Each ring felt like an eternity, her nerves building with every second. Finally, a warm voice answered. Charles Bennett speaking. Mr. Bennett, hi, Louise said, her voice shaking slightly. This is Louise, from the event last night. Ah, Louise, he said, his tone immediately brightening. I was hoping to hear from you. How are you? I'm good, she replied, though her hands trembled as she spoke. I've been thinking about what you said, about the opportunity. I'm glad to hear that, Charles said. Listen, no pressure, but I think you have something special. If you're willing, I'd love to meet with you to discuss how we could work together. Louise hesitated, her fear whispering that she should politely decline, but a stronger voice, one that she hadn't listened to in years, urged her forward. Okay, she said. When would be a good time? Charles suggested a meeting later that week at his studio, and Louise agreed. After she hung up, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like she was moving towards something instead of just surviving. The studio was located in a quiet neighborhood, tucked between a bakery and an art gallery. It was a modest building, but the warm light streaming through its windows made it feel inviting. Louise stood outside for a moment, gathering her courage before pushing open the door. Inside, the studio was a blend of old and new. Vintage microphones and sound equipment sat alongside modern technology. The walls were lined with the photographs of artists, some famous, others unknown. Louise couldn't help but wonder if her face would ever join them. Louise? Charles greeted her warmly, stepping out from behind a desk. I'm so glad you came. Thank you for inviting me, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. They sat down in a small lounge area where Charles offered her a cup of tea. He began by asking about her background, how she discovered her love for music, the struggles she had faced, and what had brought her to that pivotal moment at the party. Louise found herself opening up in a way she hadn't in years, sharing her story with surprising ease. I've seen a lot of talent in my time, Charles said after she finished. But what sets you apart isn't just your voice. It's the way you connect with people. When you sing, you make people feel something real. That's not something you can teach. It's a gift. Louise felt a lump rise in her throat. It had been so long since anyone had spoken about her voice with such sincerity. I want to help you share that gift, Charles continued. If you're willing, I'd like to work with you on a demo. Nothing too big, just a few songs to showcase your talent. From there, we can see where it takes us. The idea thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. A part of her wanted to jump at the opportunity, but the weight of her obligations held her back. I don't know if I can afford this, she said hesitantly. Charles smiled kindly. Don't worry about that. I'm not asking for anything up front. This is an investment in you, Louise. I believe in your potential, and I'm willing to take a chance. Tears pricked at her eyes as she nodded. Okay, she said softly. Let's do it. The weeks that followed were some of the most transformative of Louise's life. She spent her evenings at the studio after finishing her shifts at Langston Enterprises, recording songs and learning the intricacies of studio work. Charles was patient and encouraging, guiding her through every step of the process. Word of her talent began to spread. Musicians who worked with Charles were eager to collaborate with her, and small gigs started to come her way. Each performance brought her closer to the dream she had once thought impossible. At Langston Enterprises, however, things were different. Simon Willard, still smarting from the humiliation of the party, began to take a keen interest in her activities. He noticed her coming in late or leaving early and made it a point to remind her of her place whenever he could. But Louise was no longer the same woman who had feared his sharp words. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her focus fixed on the path ahead. For the first time in her life, she was singing not just for survival, but for herself. One evening, after a particularly long recording session, Charles handed her a freshly burned CD. "This is it," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "Your demo. We'll send it out to some contacts I have, see what doors it might open." Louise held the CD in her hands, her heart swelling with gratitude and anticipation. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer invisible. Her voice had found its way into the world, and there was no turning back. The atmosphere in Langston Enterprises had shifted in subtle yet undeniable ways since the night of the corporate party. Conversations in the halls often drifted to Louise, not as the invisible cleaner who quietly went about her tasks, but as the woman who had stunned an entire room with her voice. Whispers followed her now, some admiring, others skeptical, but none dismissive. Louise carried herself differently, too. There was a quiet confidence in her steps, a glimmer of self-assurance in her gaze that hadn't been there before. Simon Willard, however, was not pleased. From his vantage point on the top floor, Simon watched everything that happened within the company. He prided himself on maintaining control, on ensuring that nothing and no one disrupted the carefully constructed ecosystem of Langston Enterprises. But since that night, Louise's name had crept into conversations he didn't want to hear. "She could be a star," one executive had remarked during a meeting, clearly impressed by her performance. "I mean, who knew she had that in her?" Simon had bristled, quickly steering the conversation back to more important matters, but the comments stayed with him. Louise's success was a thorn in his side, not because she had excelled, but because she had done so in a way that undermined him. That night was supposed to be about his power, his control, his image. Instead, it had become her moment. Simon began to pay closer attention to Louise, scrutinizing her every move. He noticed her slipping out of the building a little earlier than usual some evenings, her tired but determined expression betraying that she wasn't just heading home to rest. He started asking pointed questions to the staff about her whereabouts, though he framed them as casual inquiries. "She's been working the same hours," one of the supervisors reported hesitantly, "but she mentioned she's been helping a friend with a project after work." Simon's lips tightened. A project? He doubted that. Louise was clearly up to something, and whatever it was, it didn't align with the role he had assigned her in his mind. He told himself it was his responsibility to maintain discipline within the company, but deep down, he knew it was more personal than that. Meanwhile, Louise was thriving in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her evenings at Charles Bennett's studio were the highlight of her days. With each recording session, she felt herself growing, not just as a singer, but as a person. She began to believe in her own worth, something she hadn't allowed herself to do in years. Charles had sent her demo to several industry contacts, and the response had been overwhelmingly positive. Offers for small gigs and showcases started rolling in, and Louise found herself balancing the demands of her new opportunities with her responsibilities at Langston Enterprises. It was exhausting, but the promise of a better future fueled her determination. One evening, after finishing her shift, Louise was heading out the back entrance of the building when Simon intercepted her. He was leaning casually against the wall, his hands in his pockets, but there was nothing casual about the sharpness in his gaze. "Louise," he said, his voice deceptively friendly. "Heading home?" "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. Simon studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been quite the talk of the office lately." "I'm just doing my job, sir," she said evenly, though she knew he wasn't talking about her cleaning duties. "Are you?" Simon asked, his tone turning pointed. "Because it seems like you've been distracted. Leaving early, staying late for reasons that have nothing to do with Langston Enterprises." Louise met his gaze, her shoulders squaring. She knew what he was trying to do, and she refused to let him intimidate her. "My work hasn't suffered," she said firmly. "If it had, I'm sure you would have heard about it." Simon's smile was thin, almost predatory. "Just remember where your priorities lie, Louise. Opportunities like the one you have here don't come easily. I'd hate to see you jeopardize it." The implication was clear, but Louise refused to let the fear he was trying to instill take root. She nodded politely and walked away, leaving Simon standing in the shadowed hallway. Her heart was pounding, but she reminded herself that she had come too far to let his words derail her. Simon returned to his office, but his mind was restless. Louise's calm defiance had unsettled him. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her, someone he had always viewed as beneath his notice. For years, he had prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his environment. Yet, this one woman was slipping through his grasp. He sat at his desk, staring out at the city skyline. For the first time in years, he felt a twinge of something he couldn't quite name. Was it guilt? Regret? He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Louise was just an employee, a talented one perhaps, but still just an employee. Whatever she was chasing, it was unlikely to last. The world was harsh, and dreams like hers rarely survived it. And yet, Simon couldn't shake the image of her standing on that stage, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. For a brief moment, he had seen her not as a janitor or a performer, but as something more. A person with a strength and dignity that even he couldn't diminish. As the weeks went on, Louise continued to balance her dual lives. She worked tirelessly at Langston Enterprises during the day and poured her heart into her music at night. Her confidence grew with each step forward, and the people around her began to take notice. Simon, however, remained a looming presence. He watched her closely, his attempts to reassert control becoming more frequent. But Louise no longer felt small in his shadow. Her voice had given her power, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it away. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither of them could avoid, a moment where their paths would collide once again. But this time, Louise wasn't the same woman she had been before. She was ready to stand her ground, and to prove that her dreams were just as valid, just as worthy as anyone else's. The night was still as Louise walked home from her final recording session. The streets, usually bustling with noise and life, were unusually quiet. She clutched the envelope Charles had given her earlier that evening, her fingers tracing the edges as if reassuring herself that it was real. Inside were contracts for her first official gig as a solo artist, an intimate showcase at a respected venue in the city. It was a modest beginning, but it was hers, and that made it monumental. The journey to this moment had been anything but smooth. Balancing her day job at Langston Enterprises with late nights in the studio had tested her endurance in ways she hadn't anticipated. But through it all, Louise felt herself growing stronger. She had learned to assert herself, to push past the fear of failure, and to embrace her identity as a singer. Arriving at her apartment, she carefully placed the envelope on her small kitchen table and sat down. She stared at it for a long moment, a smile playing on her lips. For so long, she had felt like an observer in her own life, relegated to the background while others moved forward. Now, for the first time, she felt like the main character in her own story. The next morning, Louise arrived at Langston Enterprises with a sense of finality. She had planned this moment carefully, ensuring that her transition out of the company would be smooth and respectful. Her resignation letter was tucked neatly into her bag, a symbol of the freedom she was claiming for herself. The office buzzed with its usual activity as she walked through the halls. Co-workers greeted her with polite smiles, some of them casting curious glances as if sensing a change in her demeanor. Louise felt a mix of emotions: pride, excitement, and a hint of sadness for leaving behind the people who had supported her quietly over the years. Simon Willard was in his office when Louise knocked on the door. He looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Come in," he said, leaning back in his chair. Louise stepped inside, her back straight and her chin held high. She placed the envelope on his desk and met his gaze directly. "Mr. Willard, I'm here to give my notice." Simon's eyebrows lifted slightly, though he quickly masked his surprise. "Your notice?" he repeated, his tone neutral. "Yes," Louise said firmly. "I've been given an opportunity to pursue something I've been passionate about for a long time. It's time for me to move on." Simon picked up the envelope, his fingers tapping it absently as he studied her. "I see," he said finally. "And this opportunity, does it have something to do with your performance at the party?" "It does," Louise replied, refusing to let his dismissive tone deter her. "I've been working with a music producer, and I have my first showcase next week." Simon leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Do you really think this is sustainable? The music industry isn't kind, Louise. It chews people up and spits them out. What makes you think you're any different?" Louise held his gaze, her voice calm but unwavering. "Because I've already faced worse, and I'm still standing." For a moment, Simon didn't respond. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as an employee, not as a janitor, but as a person with strength and conviction. It unsettled him, though he couldn't fully articulate why. "Well," he said finally, his tone begrudgingly neutral, "I suppose I can't stop you." "You can't," Louise agreed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Simon exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Good luck, then," he said, though the words sounded forced. "Thank you," Louise replied sincerely, "for everything, even the hard parts." She turned and left the office, her steps light but deliberate. As she walked through the building one last time, she felt a mixture of nostalgia and relief. This place had been a chapter in her life, but it wasn't the whole story. The night of the showcase arrived quickly. The venue was small but intimate, with soft lighting and a welcoming atmosphere. Louise stood backstage, her heart pounding in anticipation. She peeked through the curtains, her eyes scanning the room. Charles had been true to his word. The audience was filled with people who wanted to hear her, not just out of curiosity, but because they believed in her talent. When her name was announced, the room erupted into applause. Louise stepped onto the stage, the lights warm against her skin. She took a deep breath, gripping the microphone tightly as she faced the crowd. The first notes of her song filled the room, and with them came a sense of clarity. This was where she belonged. Every struggle, every setback, every moment of doubt had led her to this point. Her voice soared, carrying her story to everyone who listened. It wasn't just a performance. It was a declaration of who she was and who she was becoming. In the audience, Charles watched with a satisfied smile. Nearby, Simon Willard sat silently, having arrived unannounced. He had told himself it was curiosity that brought him there. But as he listened to Louise sing, he realized it was something more. Her voice stirred something in him that he couldn't ignore, a reminder that power wasn't about control, but about the ability to inspire. As the final notes of her song hung in the air, the audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous and heartfelt. Louise stood on the stage, her chest heaving as she took it all in. Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of joy, of triumph, of freedom. This was only the beginning, and Louise knew there were challenges ahead. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let it be silenced ever again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new videos. Share this video with your friends. Let them see something interesting too. Also, check out the other videos on the channel. There's lots of inspirational content. See you soon.